So as we know, prosody can be really helpful in cueing listeners into where phrase boundaries are in sentences, and this is especially important when confronted with a globally ambiguous sentence, so a sentence that has more than one possible meaning. Let's take, for example, this sentence here, which I'll let you read to yourselves. So when you read this sentence to yourself, you might have settled on one of two possible meanings, the first of which being that the teacher buys a coffee at 5 o'clock, or that the teacher teaches class at 5 o'clock. The placement of the phrase boundary, here indicated by the pound symbol, disambiguates the meaning. Phrase boundaries also ease the load of information that we're processing at a given time. So at the location of the boundary, we're integrating information about the meaning of the phrase that we have just processed. Once we integrate this information, we no longer need to keep it in our working memory, and we can shift our focus of attention to the next phrase. Since prosody is a factor of both signed and spoken languages, we were really interested to discover whether prosodic phrase boundary processing is similar across language modalities. By and large, there's really strong evidence that signed and spoken languages rely on similar neural mechanisms despite their difference in modality. For example, aphasia is manifested similarly across language modality, just as lesions in the language-specific areas of the left hemisphere in hearing individuals impact their language abilities, comparably located lesions in deaf signers also impact their sign language abilities. Excuse me, I'm just getting over a cold, I might have to pause. Moreover, it's been found that the same areas of the brain are active in both sentence perception and production for both deaf and hearing individuals. And finally, very similar distribution of signed and spoken language functioning has been reported through direct cortical stimulation procedures. Despite these multiple similarities in the neural mechanisms underlying signed and spoken languages, prosodic features are manifested quite differently across language modality. In spoken language, as we know, prosody is signaled by variation in pitch, timing, and intensity of the voice, and a common cue to prosodic phrase boundaries is rising and lowering pitch at boundary locations. In signed languages, prosodic variation is often signaled through articulators such as the face, torso, and head, and common cues to prosodic phrase boundaries include changes in head position, changes in facial expression, and blinks. Similarly, languages in both modality employ variation in timing in order to cue prosodic phrase boundaries, such as lengthening of the phrase final syllable, or sign, stress, and pauses. Critically, though, sign languages don't make use of pitch variation to cue prosodic phrase boundaries, so auditory information is sort of null in this situation. In order to effectively explore the question of whether prosodic phrase boundary processing is similar across spoken and signed languages, we needed to use a methodology that works similarly across modalities, so we used event-related potential methodology. ERPs are derived from EEG data, which collects summed electrical signal from the brain at the scalp. If you take sections of the EEG data that correspond to a stimulus and average them together, you get ERPs. An established ERP component called the closure positive shift occurs in response to prosodic phrase boundaries. So in this cartoon representation, if we look at the averaged activity surrounding a sentence with a phrase boundary, we should see the closure positive shift, the CPS, a positive shift in the waveform after a prosodic phrase boundary, and we should see a lack of such effect in a sentence with no phrase boundary. It's important to note that the convention in the field is actually to plot positive values below the x-axis, as confusing as it may be, so all future graphs in this presentation will follow that format. It's been found that the CPS can be elicited in many contexts in speech, including just regular speech, hummed speech, speech composed solely of pseudo-words, and many more. Really interestingly, it's been shown to index prosodic phrase boundaries in both speech and music, suggesting that it's indexing auditory modality-specific prosodic processing. Because of this wide variety of contexts that the CPS has been found in, there's been a lot of speculation regarding what it's actually indexing. So some early research considered the possibility that it's a response to syntactic phrasing, but this can't be true, as arguably hummed speech doesn't have syntax. It's possible that the CPS is reflecting prosody, as it has time and time again been shown to occur in response to prosodic phrase boundaries. But previous study of the CPS has not separated prosodic processing from auditory processing. One study attempted to address this issue by trying to remove the pauses at phrase boundaries from their stimuli, but this could not fully answer the question of whether the CPS is elicited by prosody or sound, because other cues to prosodic phrase boundaries, such as durational lengthening and pitch change, were still present in the stimuli. It's possible that the CPS, as it has been previously researched, is actually reflecting the auditory processing of acoustic correlates of prosody rather than prosodic processing itself. But still other evidence suggests that it may be indexing more domain general, non-modality dependent processing. Some studies of the music CPS and the language CPS suggest specifically that it may be reflecting memory and attentional allocation. Source localization procedures have indicated that when the music CPS is elicited in trained musicians, the most active areas of the brain include limbic structures that are commonly associated with memory and attention. And studies of the language CPS have found differences in the response based on attentional allocation. So when a sentence has led a listener to focus on a certain word, the CPS follows the offset of this word. This temporal shift of the response demonstrates the possibility that the CPS is indexing the resolution of attentional and memory processes at this word and is therefore reflecting closure more broadly. We also know that prosodic phrase boundaries help to relieve demand on our working memory and facilitate changing attentional allocation, just like some evidence suggests the CPS reflects. And so we can now extend our question to wonder whether prosodic phrase boundary processing as indexed by the CPS is dependent on auditory cues, or if it's reliant on modality-independent processes, which could include memory and attention. Our thoughts were that if we observe a similar CPS in both English speakers and native signers of ASL, it would suggest that prosodic phrase boundary processing as indexed by the CPS is a domain general process, non-specific to the auditory modality. But if we were to only see a CPS in English speakers, it would suggest that prosodic phrase boundary processing, again, as indexed by the CPS, is reliant on modality. So for this study, we collected data from two groups of participants. 41 monolingual English speakers were recruited from the University of Connecticut out of the psychology student body, and 16 deaf native signers were recruited from Gallaudet University in Washington, D.C., all of whom acquired ASL before the age of 5. Our stimuli were recordings of globally ambiguous sentences, which are commonly disambiguated through the placement of a prosodic phrase boundary. Our critical stimuli were 40 pairs of sentences that were identical save for the placement of a prosodic phrase boundary, which we most strongly signaled with a pause. One of the sentences in the pair had a relatively early boundary, and the other had a relatively late boundary. And so now I'll play an example of these sentences for you. It should be playing, but I don't think we're getting sound. Yeah, I'm not sure what the issue is here. I apologize. Sorry about this, guys. I can act out the sentences. All right. Sorry about that. All right, so we've got a relatively early boundary, which sounded something like, when the teacher has class, at 5 o'clock she buys a large coffee, versus a late boundary where it sounded more like, when the teacher has class at 5 o'clock, she buys a large coffee. And these were all natural productions. So now I will show you the equivalent sentences in ASL, and I'll do my best to point out the location of the boundary when it occurs. So here's the early sentence. Boundary. And now here's the late sentence. Boundary. All right, so in addition, we included 40 filler sentences, and 12 of our sentences, regardless of whether they were critical or fillers, were followed by comprehension questions. Our participants sat in front of a computer while they perceived these stimuli either as a video or auditorily, depending on their language group, while EEG was being recorded. For our analysis, we looked at 2 time windows from each sentence, one of which was surrounding the pause, and one in the complementary location of the pause in the other sentence of the pair. So to break this down a little bit, this would mean that in these examples, we pulled time windows following the words class and clock, where one of the sentences contained a pause at that location and the other one did not. This resulted in 4 conditions: an early pause and an early no pause control condition, as well as a late pause and a late no pause control condition. We averaged all of the time windows in each condition to derive our ERPs from the continuous EEG data for both language groups. And if what we're seeing in the results is the CPS, what we would expect is for the pause conditions to be more positive and therefore lower on the y-axis than the no pause conditions. In English, this was exactly what we saw. So on these graphs, the x-axis is time in milliseconds, and the y-axis is voltage in microvolts. The shaded area there is our temporal region of interest, which is 500 to 800 milliseconds post-pause onset, which is a common time frame for the closure positive shift cited in the literature. So in the early sentence position, you can see that the pause condition in red is more positive than the no pause condition in black, and the same holds true in the late sentence position, where the pause condition is in blue and the no pause condition is in green. A main effect of sentence position indicated that the effect is larger in the late sentence position than in the early sentence position. So what you're seeing here is data from a single centroparietal electrode that's centered on the midline, outlined here in blue. But we ran our statistics over this entire centroparietal region outlined now in black, which was chosen based both on preliminary whole head analysis as well as previous literature citing its distribution as centroparietal. So we can also see our effect on the heat maps for each condition, which reflect the distribution of voltage across the scalp. So in general, we can see that there's more positivity and therefore more red in the more posterior areas than there are in the frontal areas. In ASL, we found a significant CPS in both the early and late sentence positions. Like in English, a main effect of sentence position indicated that the effect is larger in the late sentence position than the early sentence position. We can see this really, really clearly on the heat maps. In both conditions, the area outlined in black is a lot more positive, a lot more red compared to the more frontal regions. But between conditions, we can also see some differences. In the late condition, there's a lot more positivity, a lot more red than in the early condition. We can also see that in this group, the positivity seems mostly limited to the posterior electrodes of our region of interest, which are now outlined in blue. Yes. So this reflects a discovered interaction between pause status and anterior to posterior electrode position, which revealed a main effect of pause status only in these most posterior electrodes that are outlined. So if I now show you an electrode instead from that area, we can see a slightly clearer effect in the early sentence position for ASL. Since we found a CPS-like effect in both of our groups, we analyzed between groups differences using difference waves. So these difference waves are the result of subtracting the activity in the no pause conditions from the activity in the pause conditions. And the goal of this is to, in theory, first allow us to see divergence from 0 versus comparing conditions by eye. And it also allows us to see more clearly in which temporal areas our 2 conditions varied. So we can see divergence from 0 in a positive direction really clearly in English, where the early condition is the purple line and the late condition is the orange line. We can also see this in the late sentence position for ASL, and a little less clearly in the early sentence position, though this is still a significant effect. We did find a main effective group in this analysis, indicating that the English difference waves are more positive, and therefore, by virtue of the fact that they are difference waves, this means that the effect is larger in English than it is in ASL. So, to recap our results, yay, we were really excited to find that our data supported our first hypothesis. We observed a CPS in both language groups. So, the implications of these findings are first that the CPS is not dependent on auditory information. and is reflecting amodal processes, and second, that there's similar processing occurring at phrase boundaries for both deaf and hearing individuals. But of course, there are still some open questions that need to be addressed. First of all, you might be wondering why the CPS in the late sentence position was bigger. This is a pattern that we saw both in English and in ASL. There are two factors that could be influencing this difference, the first of which being is that there's simply more information leading up to a phrase boundary in the late condition than in the early condition, which could be placing more demand on working memory. There are more words leading up to the phrase boundary, more processing occurring, which could be influencing the amplitude of the CPS. Second, the difference could be attributed to effects of anticipation. A phrase boundary must occur eventually, and therefore the likelihood of one increases as a sentence continues. The size of the effect could be influenced by this anticipation. Perhaps more importantly, you may be all wondering why the CPS in the English group was bigger. And this question is a little bit harder to answer. So the first thing that crossed my mind is that our ASL group may be underpowered relative to the English group. You can see that we had very different sample sizes. Though it is important to note that 16 is not an unusual sample size for ERP research, especially in a group such as deaf signers where access can be a limiting factor. Power is unlikely to be the answer to our question because random samples of 16 English-speaking individuals still show significantly larger effects than our ASL group. Another possibility is that the signal could be coming from deeper in the cortex for signers than for speakers of English. Since the signal would then have more matter to travel through, it's plausible that in this situation we might just be picking up less signal from deaf signers. So now that we know that the CPS is reflecting amodal processes, we might question whether it's true that it is specifically reflecting memory and attentional processes. This possibility is in keeping with a body of literature on wrap-up effects, which are defined by increased processing at phrase and sentence boundaries. These wrap-up effects, which are observed through eye-tracking methodology, are thought to be reflections of the updating of discourse representation as items in memory are no longer attended to and thus are removed from active processing. Based on previously discussed evidence, it could be possible that the CPS is an electrophysiological correlate of wrap-up effects. Further study could assess this question through simultaneous EEG and eye tracking data collection. We could also, I'm hesitant now to suggest that we could look at individual differences pertaining to working memory capacity and individual amplitude of the CPS, but that is always a possibility. All right, I'd like to thank you all for your attention, and of course, I'm more than happy to field questions.
We have plenty of time for questions. Again, students first, please.
I don't have a job, so I can ask. My name's Cassandra Jacobs. I'm at UC Davis. I was wondering if you thought about maybe how bimodal bilinguals, so people who grew up signing and with an oral language, might process, maybe would provide an interesting test bed for these kinds of questions. And I don't know, what do you think would happen?
So to some degree, our participants were bimodal bilinguals because they had to be able to read in English for our test battery, which also included some standardized tests, which we haven't reported on today. But if we're talking about, if we then reverse the question and talk solely about monolingual deaf individuals, that is a great question.
Thank you.
Other student questions? The floor is open. Go
Hi, Byron on Princeton University. I had a question about, first a quick question about the English ASL difference. I was wondering if this is an effect of language versus modality and how we can tease that apart. And so I wondered if, for example, you could compare the spoken and sign languages to related languages. So for example, comparing—
Excuse me, to what languages?
related languages,
Okay.
so like English to German, for example, and ASL to LSF, for example. And so you could maybe see if there's an effect of language versus modality.
Okay.
The other question was about, was sort of more broadly, is about the first Venn diagram that you posted
Sure, I can bring that up.
about the difference between spoken languages and sign languages and the types of cues that they use for boundaries. So I wonder, there's been an increasing amount of work on gesture in spoken languages, and I wonder if you could look at some of the same kinds of signals from the sign languages in spoken languages, for example, with like muted videos in a visually co-presented sentence, and just have the videos of the speakers doing the things. I think that would be a really great minimal pair for that.
Yeah, that's a very fascinating suggestion. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Wim Pauw from University of Connecticut. It's great stuff. I really liked it. I was wondering, so for example, you call it a model, and maybe we mean the same thing, but I can perceive a rhythm without hearing something, for like a tapping noise, or not a tapping, seeing a flicker of a light with a certain rhythm, right? But I can also hear a rhythm. It has the same structure in the information, even though the information has a different quality, right? Or has a different source. I would not call that, the rhythmic perception, a model. I would call it non-model specific. There's information in the signal that is the same in both. How does it rely, do you think there is some abstract processing that somehow extracts this from a signal, or is it just rhythm perception? For example, in the kinematics of the movements from the signers might have a stop somewhere that is also present for speaking participants.
So if I understand correctly, especially in that last bit, you're saying, I'm sorry, I'm going to ask you to rephrase.
So what do you mean with a model? So non-model specific, or do you mean that there is some computation being done? For example, if they're only showing something with their faces in the participants that sign, then it might not be a rhythmic structure as such, for example, which you would have in more durational boundaries, which is the same for spoken language. So my question is, what do you mean with a model?
By a modal, we specifically mean non-modality dependent. Yeah, so we consider this to be amodal because the signers aren't using any auditory information and the speakers aren't using any visual information.
Yeah, but it's still, then you would still agree that it's in the perceptual signal. There is information which you can use in a similar way as a speaker does. Is that the same? That's the question. And I think that's a modality seems to signal that it might be different. But yeah, we can talk about this. I'm not being that clear, maybe. Thanks.
Dwayne Watson. I think my question is related to this question. So when you started, I got kind of garden pathed on what you were going to do. I thought you were going to present ASL to spoken or to English language users and look to see whether you got a CPS just from someone who doesn't speak ASL. And I see you did another great study, but I'm wondering whether you've thought about doing something like that to see whether there are these sort of generalized cues that people can use to parse the signal.
Yeah, so if we consider that the CPS might be just reflecting closure on a broader scale, it is definitely possible that for people who are not exposed to sign languages, just seeing some of these cues, especially a pause in signing, could induce some sort of closure-related effect. I'd be more hesitant to connect that to memory, not as hesitant to connect it to attention, just because saying that memory is implicated there would suggest that there's a level of comprehension occurring. So it's definitely possible, and that is a wonderful idea.
Other questions?
Stephanie Shattuck-Nagel. I'm not sure whether this question has been asked already or not, because everybody is suggesting great experiments for you to do in the future. But could you ask a truly bilingual speaker to do both of your experiments?
In that case, they obviously would not be a native signer of ASL. Oh, actually, no, that's not true. Sorry. Sorry, Marie.
They're not easy to find. But
Though we have one right
if-
in front of us.
Yes, if you were to find enough, it would
Right.
be very interesting.
Great, thank you.
There are lots more hearing signers exposed to ASL from birth than there are deaf signers exposed to ASL from birth. Unfortunately, yeah. I don't know, not unfortunately. It's the unfortunate part is that so few deaf people are exposed to ASL early.
Thank you.
Other questions? Still have a couple of minutes. Could I? First of
Sure.
all, following up with Brent, could you re-show the ASL signs and highlight where the boundary was?
Sure, so if people could not hear, what I'll be doing is showing the ASL stimuli again and reminding you again where the boundaries are. All right. So here's the early sentence, and you'll see it after the sign for teacher, which I cannot, class, sorry. Here. All right. Right there, sorry, after this here. I can try my best. No, it just restarts, I'm sorry. But that's... She wants you to say the process of the signs as they... Oh, yes, sorry. I am not fluent in ASL, so I might not be very good at this. It's being suggested that Marie could do so. Thank you.
Teacher, class, time 5. She buys coffee, a big one. Oh. Okay. Okay, the next one with the late boundary. Teacher, class, time 5. She buy coffee, giant.
Do you think it's durational or do you think it's relaxation?
I think those two things go together. I mean, so one thing about these stimuli is that they are completely uncontrolled for all of that stuff. So, I mean, we can go back and measure all of those things and see if we can get more detailed results. But we have just done the early versus late at this point. So, yeah, yes. We can't generate ASL like you can generate spoken language, right? Or not yet, I don't know, that's possible, but.
The reason I ask is you probably know that Adam Kendon has this idea that gestures in speech, co-speech gestures come in groups, and at the end of the group, relax.
Yes, so when Dwayne was suggesting the study where we show ASL to non-signers, it has been found by Diane Brentarian and some of her colleagues that non-signers are sensitive to certain prosodic breaks in ASL, but they're pretty coarse. They're not, yeah, they might be able to detect this break based on that rhythm, as Wim suggested, but I don't think they would have the processing that goes along with it because they're not processing the language, right? They're just using this very coarse rhythmic signal, but it's an open question.
Thank you.